Okay, now let's get into the nitty gritty of the case, starting with the issue. The issue is whether the Commerce Clause authorizes the federal government to grant licenses to coastal vessels doing business across state lines. This is kind of actually a sort of narrow way of understanding the case because it's not so much what the answer to this question is, and spoiler alert, the answer is yes. It's how the court goes, like how it reasons its way to that conclusion. It's, really one of the earliest cases to sort of shape the meaning of the Commerce Clause. Here's the language of the clause that the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. We're not really going to talk in this class much about commerce with native peoples or with other countries. We will talk a lot about what it means to have commerce among the several states. And just like all the other powers that Congress has, they can be found in Article 1, Section 8. There's a reason why I've underlined these parts of the Commerce Clause, because the way the case unfolds is that Chief Justice Marshall starts from wanting to define what commerce is, then also defining what it means for commerce to exist among the several states, because that gives you an understanding of when Congress gains power to regulate commerce, because a commerce that exists solely within one state, that power rests entirely with state governments. And then you also need to understand what it means to have the power to regulate something, because that gives you a sense as to how much power over commerce Congress has. And then finally, you have to potentially look to other parts of the Constitution for other limits on any of Congress's powers. So, for instance, even if you had a legitimate regulation of commerce occurring among the several states, if that regulation was, only Christian businesses could get a certain kind of license, well, guess what? If you look to the First Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids placing barriers on or forbids Congress from favoring one religion over another, that's a limit on how Congress can use its commerce power. So let's start with the first question. What does commerce include? And before he actually answers the question, he sort of situates the argument in a way that hopefully seems similar to how we discuss things in, McCulloch versus Maryland. Marshall says the subject to be regulated is commerce, and our Constitution being one of enumeration and not of definition. To ascertain the extent of the power, it becomes necessary to settle the meaning of the word. And remember, we talked about how the federal government has enumerated powers. It's a list of powers in Article 1, Section 8. But there is some flexibility in that list. Remember, in McCulloch, they said, only the great outlines of a constitution should be marked, and the minor ingredients should not be included. So by saying that the Constitution is one of enumeration, it means that there's a list, but that list isn't all that specific. The opposing concept would be if we had a constitution of definition, everything would be fixed in stone. There would be no exceptions. It would be much more sort of strict constructionist. Therefore, it would probably be a lot easier to answer the question of what is commerce. But we have to allow for at least some flexibility in how we understand the term, because it's part of a constitution where there's supposed to be some flexibility. Okay, so we end up with contending definitions of commerce. Ogden's attorneys want to limit the power of the federal government, because if they limit the power of the federal government, then the New York state-based monopoly will prevail and they will win and keep making lots of money. So Ogden says his lawyer tells the court that their understanding of commerce would limit it to traffic, to buying and selling or the interchange of commodities, and do not admit that it comprehends navigation. Remember, when you put goods on a ship or a truck or a plane, you haven't actually bought or sold those goods. You're taking those goods to market where they can be sold. But if you understand commerce as merely the buying and selling, then Congress has no business regulating how they get transported to market, right? So limiting commerce to traffic is the same thing as what it means to get busted for drug trafficking, the buying or selling of the drugs. But that's not what Marshall's going to go with. Marshall's response, he says, look, that would restrict a general term applicable to many objects to one of its significations. In other words, it's too strict of a definition of commerce. In the same way that in McCulloch, we learned about how things could be necessary, very necessary, or indispensably necessary. That, a term that's flexible, like necessary, there are different ways of understanding it. And commerce is a flexible term, and to define it solely in terms of the buying and selling would limit it to only one of its meanings. So, what's a more flexible understanding of commerce? Marshall says it's not that buying and selling isn't a part of commerce, but it's something more. Commerce is intercourse. Now, I'll give you a chance to pause the video and giggle, right? Because in the 21st century, we use the term intercourse for something very different. But in the 19th century, please get your minds out of the gutter because it means something else. Here's Webster's first dictionary, published right around the time this case was handed down, and it defines intercourse very differently. Literally a running or passing between, hence communication, commerce, connection by reciprocal dealings between persons or nations, either in common affairs and civilities and trade or in correspondence by letters. So intercourse is also a really flexible term. It could be used to describe having a relationship with your friends and neighbors and going to visit them, right? It could be, the thing that you think it means in the 21st century, right? But nations have and individuals have like an economic intercourse by having an exchange of commodities, purchasing and selling by treaties and contracts, etc. So it's not just the buying and selling, but it's also the sort of the execution of the whole commercial process. And the whole commercial process has to involve transporting goods to market. Otherwise, those goods can never be sold. So the goods are running across state lines in order to be sold. And so that's what makes it, in Marshall's mind's, commerce. So does navigation fall under the definition of commerce as intercourse? Marshall says yes, emphatically. The power over commerce, including navigation, was one of the primary objects for which the people of America adopted their government. Why? The Articles of Confederation, the Constitution that came before the Constitution, didn't allow the federal government to have any meaningful control over the national economy, and it led to, it was just disastrous, absolutely disastrous. So that's one argument, that the federal government should have broad power over commerce. It's because we wanted a clean break with our constitutional past. But then Marshall makes another argument, and that is, he says, it is a rule of construction acknowledged by all that the exceptions from a power mark its extent. In other words, if you go and look at where the Constitution says you can't do something, it suggests that anything short of that is something that the government can do. So, Article 1, Section 8 contains the lists of things that Congress can do. Article 1, Section 9 contains the list of things that Congress can't do. And Congress can't favor the ports of one state over those of another, which suggests that because ports are where goods get shipped through, not where goods get bought or sold, that the why would the Constitution need Congress to treat every port equally and not favor northern ports over southern ports? Because if Congress doesn't have the power to regulate commerce by regulating the shipping of goods to and through the ports, then Congress has no ability to regulate the ports at all. So you wouldn't need a prohibition against favoring some ports over others if Congress's commerce power doesn't let it regulate the ports at all. So because it contains that limitation of not playing favorites, it suggests that Congress's legitimate commerce power includes making sure that goods make it to and from ports. And as a result of these kinds of arguments, Marshall concludes a power to regulate navigation is as expressly granted by the Constitution as if that term had been added to the word commerce. In other words, what he's effectively saying is, we're not just treating like this is, at the periphery, it's sort of related to what commerce does. No, by this logic, Congress's power to regulate navigation is as clearly sanctioned by the Constitution as if the Constitution had written a more detailed commerce clause that included the words navigation. Pretty bold statement, right? Okay, so here's the question. When can Congress regulate commerce? Marshall starts off by saying, the subject to which the power is next applied is commerce among the several states. The word among means intermingled with. A thing which is among others is intermingled with them. Commerce among the states cannot stop at the external boundary of each state, but may be introduced into the interior. And so why is this so important that the federal government has the ability to regulate commerce that is intermingled among the states or goes across the states? And that is, again, remember, the Articles of Confederation set up too weak of a federal government. The U.S. Constitution wanted to do things better. And the genius and character of the whole federal government system seems to be that its action is to be applied to all the external concerns of the nation. In other words, all the things that we as a country need to work together on so that we can conduct foreign affairs, right, or trade with other countries, but also to those internal concerns which affect the states generally, problems that are sort of unique, that don't involve other countries, but involve all of the states together, but not those problems that are completely within a particular state. So if there's a commercial issue that is completely within a particular state, the state government and only the state government can regulate it. But as soon as an internal concerns affect the country as a whole, that's where the federal government can step in. That's what that means. This is interesting, right? Because do you literally have to cross state lines in order for you to have commerce among the several states? And on this slide, it seems like it's all about boundary lines, right? And so maybe you do need a business transaction to physically cross a state line. But here we get a sort of more flexible understanding that any internal concerns that affect the states generally, and you could have a problem in one state that affects the country as a whole, even if that problem doesn't physically involve the crossing of lines into other states. If you have, if one state government allows complete and total deforestation or environmental degradation, That creates commercial problems in other states, even though the environmental damage or the chopping down of trees might only take place within one state. It could definitely affect the states generally. So Marshall isn't quite clear about how far Congress's power goes. Although in this case, it's not all that important whether you have a physical crossing of a boundary line or something that affects the states generally, because in this case, you have Gibbons going from the state of New Jersey into Staten Island, right, which is part of New York. You have a physical crossing of state boundaries. One interesting sort of implication of Marshall's opinion is that, let's say you have a ferry journey that starts in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, which I think is somewhere in Hudson County, or maybe it's over by, I'm sorry, I can't remember. But let's say it starts in Elizabethtown, it goes to Staten Island, then it goes to Brooklyn, then it goes to Manhattan, then it goes all the way up to the Bronx. How much of that ferry journey can Congress regulate? Because it looks like perhaps only the part of the journey where you go from one state to the other, but not when you go from within the same state to another part of the same state, to another part of the same state, to another part of the same state. And Marshall says, no, the entire trip involves the crossing of state lines. And so the entire trip can be regulated, even if most of the trip simply involves going from within one state to another part of the same state. So it's in this way, it kind of involves both things affecting the states, but also involving a physical crossing of a state line. Okay, now let's talk about how much power Congress has to regulate commerce. And so to figure out how much power, it might be helpful to look at the limits on power. And so I want to introduce this idea that there are, and it's talked about in the background of the readings as well, and that is internal and external limits on power. So this isn't about crossing, from internally from one state to externally into another state. So I'm sorry that these slides go back to back. This is not about the sort of crossing of state lines that we talked about a couple of slides ago. This is about limits on the extent on federal power, and do you find those limits within the same clause of the Constitution? In that case, it's an internal limit, or do you find it from a limit on federal power from somewhere else in the Constitution, which we would call an external limit? So internal limits are found within the clause being interpreted. So here's an example of an internal limit that, until the Supreme Court ignored 100 years worth of precedent and decided that this internal limit was meaningless, but for the 100 years before our current Supreme Court, the internal limit at the beginning of the Second Amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the right. And that meant that the Second Amendment had nothing to do with the right to own guns privately. It only meant that the right to own guns as it pertains to service in a well-regulated militia, which today we call the National Guard. So you want to understand the extent to which gun ownership is protected by the Second Amendment. It's limited here, or at least it was. An external another internal limit is to say, if something is commerce, but it's wholly internal to one state, it doesn't affect commerce in the other states, right? Congress can't regulate it. We call that intra-state commerce, whereas whenever you have commerce crossing state lines or affecting the entire country, it's interstate commerce. Just like if you had commerce across country lines, it would be international. Okay, external limits are imposed by other clauses in the Constitution, right? So I kind of gave this example earlier, but to repeat it, let's say Congress uses its Commerce Clause power to license businesses in some sort of industry, and the law includes a provision that only businesses owned by white people or Christians can get a license. this would violate the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and this would violate the First. Those are external limits on how Congress can use its Commerce Clause. And so, why do we care about internal and external limits to the Congress's Commerce Clause? And the reason we care so much is because it's part of a larger debate that's going to continue for 2 more centuries throughout this entire semester, I think is a better way of putting it, over what the Constitution's role is, or what the federal government's role is in regulating the economy. Was Congress simply supposed to keep one state from undermining other states by using state laws that would sort of undercut other states? Or was Congress empowered to enact regulations to grow the national economy as a whole? And in this case, it kind of doesn't matter how you answer this question, because you have both things happening. You have a state law passed in New York that undermines the ability for businesses that are based in New Jersey to be able to compete, right? But you could argue that by having Congress be in charge of handing out licenses to all steamboats that travel across ports in different states to deliver goods, that would be a good way to sort of develop the industrial economy. So, at least in this case, the answer to both of these questions is yes. This law was designed to solve this smaller problem, but also designed to fulfill this bigger vision. So, how much power does Congress have? Well, we know it crosses state lines. We know it's legitimately commerce. We know we don't have to worry about, the First Amendment or the 14th Amendment. So how much power is left? The only other thing we have to define is what it means to regulate. And Marshall defines that as the ability to prescribe the rule by which commerce is to be governed, to write any rule that you want, to decide how commercial transactions are going to take place. Right? And yeah, here it is. Like, it could be either conception of economic power, because New York is undermining New Jersey's monopoly, right? Okay. So how far does the power to regulate extend? He says this power, like all others vested in Congress, is complete within itself, may be exercised to its utmost extent, and acknowledges no limitations other than are prescribed in the Constitution. 2 things about this quote from Marshall. 1, it is one of the most famous quotes in the history of constitutional law. You will see this on an exam. Make sure you understand who said it and in what case, right? Second, what does it mean? It means that once something is within Congress's power, Congress has the right to exercise its power however much it wants. The only limitation are ones prescribed in the Constitution. Now, so this potentially leaves the door open. We've talked about, the First Amendment or the 14th Amendment serving as an external limit. But what about the 10th Amendment? The 10th Amendment says all powers not given to the federal government nor prohibited to the states belong to the states. And so perhaps what Marshall is saying here is where Congress has the right to act because multiple states are involved, it can act as much as it wants. But perhaps we should understand the 10th Amendment and, this quote-unquote states' rights. By the way, I hate using the term states' rights. Individual people have rights. Governments have powers. And states' rights is also problematic because it's always used as a code for a state's desire to make discriminatory legislation against, groups that it disfavors. But that's the term that is sort of floating around there that a lot of people are familiar with in describing the 10th Amendment. And so why could the 10th Amendment possibly be an external limit on Congress's power? It basically says, look, you need to, in order to respect a state's authority to regulate things that happen within its own borders, The federal government has to stay out as much as it can. But we've already learned that the federal government isn't going to stay out as much as it can because the way Marshall writes this opinion, he says you can't just give Congress the power to regulate going from this part of New Jersey to New York. If you have a journey that goes from New Jersey to New York to New York to New York to New York, Congress can regulate all of it. The 10th Amendment approach would suggest, yeah, Congress can regulate this part, but not this part to this part to this part, right? Okay. Yeah, so again, this is a really, really famous quote. And yet, I really don't think there's any way. Here's another reason why I don't think the 10th Amendment serves as an external limit on Congress's power. Because Marshall says the sovereignty of Congress, or the ability, the right of to act of Congress, though limited to specified objects. So Congress doesn't have the right to act over everything. It can only act through the things specified in Article 1, Section 8. But once you find something on that list, the power of Congress is plenary as to those objects. It is the only government that's in charge. And it is completely in charge. That's what the word plenary means. If you didn't know what plenary meant, those are the kinds of things when you're going through the reading, please look it up in a dictionary, post an annotation so that your classmates can learn along with you. So the sovereignty of Congress is plenary as to those objects, and so the power of over commerce among the several states is vested in Congress as absolutely as it would be in a single government. In other words, it's as if the states do not exist and that the only government in the entire country is the federal government. So under this reading, I just do not understand how the 10th Amendment matters at all when it comes to Congress and the Commerce Clause. But other people are going to disagree, and those other people are going to get to write majority opinions that we're going to read throughout the semester. This is very much only sort of the opening salvo in an ongoing debate. And so, but, poor Ogden and the New York legislature, they're losers here. And their final sort of argument is, well, wait a second, if the big bad federal government can just come in and I'm like, what power do we have as a state from getting sort of bulldozed by the federal government? Shouldn't we be able to go to court and protect our interests? And Marshall's like, yeah, no. Win an election. The only thing that keeps Congress from overextending its commerce power are elections. The wisdom and discretion of Congress shapes the way that they use their power, and that wisdom and discretion is also based on who gets elected. That's it. Right? You don't like a certain policy, repeal and replace. Elect new members of Congress who will do that. And then the follow-up argument is, well, but let's say a national majority in Congress hates a regional minority and uses federal power the federal government to disempower them. Marshall's rejoinder is Congress's laws must be uniform. You can't pass a law that only applies in like blue states or red states. But the answer basically has to be political. That you turn to elections and the wisdom of Congress and not to judges whenever you think that the 10th Amendment is being violated. So we're coming to the end here. Here are a couple more things to focus on as you're doing your reading because these might make for good short answer questions on an exam. So remember from the very first or the earliest slides, Marshall's idea of a constitution of enumeration and definition, and what kinds of limits does the Constitution place on Congress's ability to wield power. So if you can talk a little bit about internal and external limits, maybe give an exam question. I'm going to ask you to give a specific example of an internal limit or a specific example of an external limit. But if you can answer those, I think you're going to be in really good shape. But if you have any other questions, again, pause the video, ask questions. I'm here to help. And I hope you enjoy the reading, and I'll see you next time.